doctrine. The Hannibal doctrine was actually used. They claim it was basically done away with, and it basically applies to what they call Israeli military officials. The thrust of the Hannibal doctrine is the following: is that if, for example, you see, it's a directive. It's a procedure that, and they claim that they've done away with it. What normally happens is that where there's a kidnapping of, say, a military official, a military or a soldier for that particular matter, then that kidnapping must be stopped at all means, even if it means that you strike and you harm the person or you kill the person with your own force. I think this doctrine first came out in the 80s. I think it was the mid 80s, because what had happened then, if you look at 82, before that, there was the Lebanon, the invasion of Lebanon in 82, where again Israel committed massacres of untold proportions. And you are probably familiar with the Sabra and Shatila massacres, of where in a period of 2 days, close to 3,000 Palestinians were butchered and killed by phalangists, and this was overseen by the Israeli Defense Force that had secured the area and allowed these Lebanese phalangists and these Christian phalangists to just simply massacre these Palestinians. What had happened was in 86, there were a number of abductions by IDF of soldiers in Lebanon, and there were the so-called these so-called prisoner exchanges, in terms of which we get your soldiers and then we bargain and negotiate. And I think it had to do with, I believe, the forces that were fighting the Israelis back then. I think it was Hezbollah. What then happened is that they introduced this directive, and this directive stated, the Hannibal Directive, that if you can't stop this kidnapping because it'll put you in a state of disadvantage, then you ensure that the kidnapper and the person who is kidnapped must be killed. So this basic process has gone on from time immemorial from that particular period. They claimed that the IDF chief of staff in 2016 had apparently revoked it. And this was basically, I think, it was in relation to the chap that was kidnapped, the individual, what's his name, Gilad Shalit, I think sometime around 2016. And then they claimed that this directive had been done away with. But it's quite clear that if you look at the facts on the particular ground that happened on the 7th of October, what we see out playing in real time appears to be something like the Hannibal Directive. Because a number of people that were kidnapped on that day or taken as hostages were members of the Israeli Defense Force together with Israeli civilians. So it's not untoward to believe that this is a so-called unique situation, and that Israel would have particularly invoked this specific doctrine in order to prevent the idea that hostages are taken, and then it puts Israel on a back foot, in terms of which it would be forced to now negotiate about the thousands of Palestinians that are kept under illegal administrative detention on the West Bank, and certainly languishing in the torture cells of Israel. So what initially happened on December, October, we were told that 2,000 people were killed. This was the figures that we were at least hearing in South Africa, at least on the news that we were getting on Associated Press and Reuters. The figures were then basically reduced after about, I think, a week to 1,200. And then that was being trumped out that, look, 1,400 people were being killed over and above the number of civilians that were taken in captivity. And then we were also told about the fact that babies were beheaded, 40 beheaded babies, and that women were basically raped, and that women were sexually violated. All of that could be traced to one particular journalist. And in fact, at that time, I think CNN, or it was captured on news, that CNN officials were even told, the CNN journalists were told to simulate, for example, that they're being attacked by Hamas and by Israel at the early stages of this particular conflict. We then got to realize that the beheaded babies story was totally fabricated. Joe Biden, who initially parroted this rubbish had to do a about turn because there was no eyewitness testimony for that. And further, there was no eyewitness testimony, and there has never been an eyewitness testimony of rape that took place up to this day. Nobody has come out. Those hostages or those civilians that were released by Hamas, in fact, give a very positive account on their treatment by Hamas when they were kept in custody. In fact, they mentioned the elderly lady, I think the 87-year-old lady, stated that she was under fear of the Israeli bombings of Gaza at that particular point in time. Because Israel's bombing, we can make the argument whether it's indiscriminate or discriminate, but they were in fear of the fact that they would be killed, these hostages, which just goes to show that Israel cares dilly squat about these hostages. But be that as it may, the so-called mass rape was done away with. The electronic intifada, for example, goes into a lengthy detail in terms of how this particular story is garbage, and that the actual crime that is alleged to have stated to have occurred never took place. Eventually, once all this garbage was put aside, and by the time that people realized that this was false and this information was correct, there were no beheaded babies, no beheaded children. We haven't even seen a single image of a beheaded person. I've seen clips of the 43 minutes. There were no beheaded babies or raped children. But once that was already debunked, Israel had already began its insane attack on Gaza. And I think we had, at that stage, close to 5,000 people had already been killed and being murdered. Eventually, in November 2023, MSNBC, which was led by the excellent journalist Mahdi Hassan, I believe he was removed after the show. I'm not so sure if he's back again doing his program, but he challenged the Israeli spokesperson, this propagandist that I've spoken about, Mark Regev, about the many lies and the claims that Israel had made to justify its genocidal bombing. And when he was attempting to respond to that particular question, he was trying to shift and change the narrative. Eventually, he made one admission. And his admission was this. He stated that originally, they made the claim that Hamas had come in and burnt everybody. And so they had given the casualty figure to 1,400, including the bodies that were burnt allegedly by Hamas. He made the admission on television that out of the 1,400 casualties, Israel has now officially reduced the figure to 1,200 because they claim that they've overestimated and made the mistake. And they are not, he made the claim. This can be seen if you open up the link that I've sent to the brother from the electronic intifada. You can see the video. He makes the point that the bodies that they thought that they were burnt were actually Hamas terrorists. This is his own words. They were burnt, and they were burned by Hamas terrorists, and it actually, we had burnt them. In other words, this is exactly what he says. So if he burned them, and you see pictures of burning and the houses being burnt, and there was an entire convoy of motor vehicles that were totally burnt out and destroyed, and they looked like they had been struck, it's quite clear that who burned them? Who burned them? It's quite clear that Israel burned them. And now we are told that Israeli Apache helicopters basically came in and attacked Hamas. But in the process of burning Hamas, what they failed to realize that there were other burned bodies there, and those burned bodies were in all likelihood burned by Israel. This is confirmed by Mark Regev in his interview with Mahdi Hassan. And so he's caught out on that particular point, because the burned bodies were always used as an excuse to commit the genocide in Gaza, and they were basically pointed out. In fact, this one of your own guys, what's his name, from the Henry Jackson Society, Douglas Murray. He went on at the initial stages, and he's sent in as an embedded journalist to Tel Aviv, and I see him sitting in Tel Aviv, and he claims to be in a war zone like a hypocrite, that he's seen these burned bodies. He's seen all these burned bodies in the hospitals. He's witnessed the burned bodies, and it is atrocious. Which burned bodies did he see? When Mark Regev, who is the propagandist for Israel, conceded on live television on MSNBC that the burned bodies were Hamas burned bodies, and he says that they made a mistake. But if they are burned Hamas bodies, what about the other burned houses? What about the burned cars? What about the civilians who burned them? Now Israel hasn't mentioned anything along that line. So as it stands right now, the actual figures are something like 1,139 in total. Out of the 1,139, approximately 420 were apparently Israeli soldiers. And even though it claimed that it had direct evidence, if you look at the 43-minute video that they showed a selected group of audience, I don't know if you've seen those 43 minutes. I think it could be downloaded from the dark web. But there's no image of Hamas burning anyone, nothing at all. There's no image of Hamas beheading anybody, no image of Hamas beheading babies, no image of Hamas raping anyone. Yes, you do see people getting killed and people being taken away, but Israel up to this date has never been able to explain how on earth these fighters, if it was Hamas as they initially did, could cause such an enormous amount of damage to the Israeli houses if they only had light weapons that they were seen carrying, because they came in these hang gliders. And obviously, the Hamas fires, the Hamas organization, the members, they didn't set themselves on fire. And Israel obviously got to know the circumstances in terms of which these people died. So if they died by virtue of the fact that they were blown up by the Israeli Apache helicopter gunships, then that's a significant addition to the mounting evidence that Israeli forces actually went on this panicked rampage and they started firing wildly with their powerful weapons, and they killed both Palestinian fighters and indeed the Israeli civilians that were there. If you look at the testimonies of the survivors at the kibbutz, there was a lady, Yasmin Porat. She mentioned that she saw the helicopters which had these large amounts of these cannon shells and these Hellfire missiles, and the pilots weren't able to make the distinction between the Palestinians and the Israeli civilians at all. They couldn't make the distinction who's a soldier, who's a civilian. So as when we hear reports of one of the squadron leaders telling the people that, look, shoot everything, they basically shooted everything. So this idea of the civilian death toll being so high because Hamas is using civilians as human shields, or that they use them on the 7th of October, it's debunked by their own official narrative that is coming out. So the question at the end of the day is who benefits. The other point is, which I've also sent you the article on the New York Times report, we are given to understand that as early as a year before the incident, Israel apparently had the full details about what transpired on the 7th of October in terms of the plan, which they called Operation Jericho. If you again check the New York Times was the first article to basically blow this up into full exposure in terms of what transpired. And then, of course, Electronic Intifada recovered that particular article. But they basically made the point that Israel knew in advance a year ago what basically happened, or what was going to happen, or what the plan was going to basically take place on that particular day to the letter. Now, the point is that it's quite clearly that they would have got this specific information via some form of intelligence in terms of what transpired, or somebody would have informed them. But it's quite clear that they knew the information, they knew the end game, and they did nothing about it. So was this possibly a false flag operation? Was this something that Israel needed? Because it provided a convenient excuse for Israel to engage in its particular acts of sanguinary warfare and mass genocide. And the point people basically are asking is that, is it possible that this could have been a false flag operation? Would they have done this? Because, I mean, there's other false flag operations that have happened in the past, like the Lavon affair. Check up what the Lavon affair is in relation to that. Check up what happened prior to the incident. Check up why is it that at the given moment when you can't come to the fence entering Israel, how is it that on that particular day all these fighters were managed to get inside Israel? What happened? How did the Israeli soldiers stand down? So All these questions are not being asked, are not being looked at. And so the general propaganda is what happened on October 7th. I'm also saying let's not even go back, because a lot of our Muslim brothers, and I see some of the interviews, when they questioned about October 7th, they say, well, we need to go back to the history, 75 years. And sometimes you lose by default, because why go back 75 years? Why not just go back 2 days before October 7th? 2 days before October 7th, Israel launched a pogrom, a massacre in the Huwara village in West Bank, where they killed 6 Palestinians. Prior to that, this year alone, hundreds of settlers invaded Al-Aqsa Mosque. All those actions are illegal under international law. In this year alone, 2023, look at the count in terms of how many Palestinians were killed before the October 7th. This year alone, between 2022 to 2023, how many Palestinians were killed, either by raids, either being killed on the West Bank by the Israeli settlers and the Israeli Defense Force? How many Palestinians were killed? More than 200, close to 300. Look at the figures. So look at what happened over the past 2 years before October 7th, and then you juxtapose it with what happened to October 7th. October 7th, which they are putting forth as the total, the worst massacre that has ever been committed since the Second World War as a result of the Nazi Germany's Holocaust. That's now basically blown up into smithereens. But it's too late. It's too late, because they've already massacred 21,000. It was convenient for them to engage in what they did, and they needed the beheaded babies. They needed the burnt Israeli civilians. They needed the rape, because that would create the sympathy, it would garner global support, and that would give them an ideal leverage and indeed a convenient weapon of mass distraction to commit its atrocious conduct in terms of what is going on at this particular juncture.